Alright, so a lot of shit is going down right now. The House recently voted on a bill to send a one-time means-tested $2,000 check to some Americans. That bill is now waiting to be voted on in the Senate, where McConnell has publicly come out against sending $2,000 to Americans. I already put out a video discussing how Bernie Sanders is threatening to block the Senate's scheduled override of Donald Trump's veto of the $740 billion defense bill for 2021, unless McConnell brings the bill to send one-time $2,000 checks to the American public up for a vote in the Senate. I think McConnell's calling Bernie's bluff, but I hope Bernie stays true to his commitment and holds up this defense bill, unless McConnell promises to vote on relief to the American public. While this is an example of Bernie Sanders using leverage to force a vote on a bill that would offer some more assistance to the American public, so this proves that if progressives decide to use their leverage, it can potentially have real effects. Now, even though Bernie has pledged to use his leverage in this case to fight for $2,000 checks, he has still been absent from supporting the campaign to force the vote on Medicare for All in the House of Representatives by demanding that progressives in the House withhold their support for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker unless she promises to at least bring Medicare for All to the House floor for a vote. The Bull Moose Note strongly supports the Force the Vote campaign. Not only is Nancy Pelosi a war criminal who helped the Bush administration cover up the CIA's torture program and then refused to impeach Bush for lying the United States into Iraq, she also stood in the way of passing a $1.8 trillion stimulus that was being proposed by the White House that would have sent Americans a $1,200 check before the holidays, all because she didn't want to give Trump a legislative victory before the elections. In addition, she's currently standing in the way of bringing Medicare for All to the House floor for a vote, even though the policy is supported by nearly 90% of Democratic voters and more than 70% of the public. As a result, it's no surprise that a whopping 3/4 of the public believes that Pelosi should step down as House Speaker. Over the last few weeks, a conversation about whether or not progressives in the House of Representatives should leverage their support for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House based on whether or not she promises to bring Medicare for All to a vote on the House floor has overtaken left-wing corners of the internet. It all began when self-proclaimed jag-off comedian Jimmy Dore discussed the plan to force the vote on Medicare for All on his independent YouTube show, The Jimmy Dore Show. Dore explained that as a result of Democrats losing multiple seats in the House after the most recent elections, margins in the House are so thin that it would only take a handful of elected progressives to force Nancy Pelosi to bring Medicare for All to the House floor for a vote if she wants to get reelected as Speaker of the House. This is one of the final opportunities for progressives to use their leverage to force Pelosi to bring Medicare for All up for a vote in the House. Unfortunately, as of right now, Pelosi has almost unanimous support among most elected progressives. So far, the only elected progressives who've indicated that they might not support Pelosi for Speaker are Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. In a recent appearance on CNN, the pair of newly elected progressives refused to say whether or not they'd be supporting Pelosi for Speaker. Rather than pledge their support for Pelosi, they made it clear that they'd be listening to the demands of the organizers within the communities they've been elected to represent. This is a promising sign that some elected progressives might be receptive to withholding their support for Pelosi unless she promises to bring Medicare for All to the House floor for a vote, if enough of their constituents pressure them to do so. Here's a list of elected progressives that you can call and tell them to force the vote. According to independent journalist, former press secretary for the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign, and co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, Brianna Joy Gray, there are more than 100 members of the Progressive Caucus in the House. So if progressives are actually willing to organize against their own party's leadership, it shouldn't be difficult to get a few of them to support leveraging Pelosi's speakership to force a vote on a policy that is supported by nearly 90% of Democrats and 70% of the public in general. Gray tweeted a few days ago, when over 80% of Democrats support a policy, but barely 50% of Democrats in the People's House will back it, that's a crisis. Progressives didn't elect candidates just to believe in Medicare for All. They elected them to fight for Medicare for All. Hashtag force the vote. In an article by Gray in Current Affairs, she explained that the only way for a bill to be brought out of its committee and onto the floor where it can publicly be debated without having majority of votes in the House is if the Speaker decides to bring the bill to the floor for a vote themselves. Unfortunately, Nancy Pelosi has refused to use her power as Speaker to bring Medicare for All to the House floor for a vote, even though Democrats hold a majority in the House, and nearly 90% of Democratic voters support the policy. What's been even more disappointing to see are the reactions that elected progressives have had to the Force the Vote campaign. During an exchange on Twitter a few weeks ago, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responded to a tweet by Chargers running back and member of the People's Party Advisory Council, Justin Jackson, where he was talking about the Jimmy Dore Show's plan to pressure progressives in the House of Representatives to withhold their support for Pelosi as Speaker in the House, unless she promises to bring Medicare for All to the House floor for a vote. Jackson tweeted, "If AOC and the squad don't do what Jimmy Dore has suggested and withhold their vote for Pelosi for speakership, unless Medicare for All gets brought to the floor for a vote, they will be revealing themselves. Power concedes nothing without demand." Representative Ocasio-Cortez responded by implying that forcing a vote on Medicare for All right now would be short-sighted and actually detract from the progress organizers have made to make the policy so popular in the minds of the general public, since there aren't enough votes yet to pass Medicare for All in the House. Fighting party leadership could result in progressives losing favorable committee assignments, and having the policy voted down could cause public support for it to decrease. However, people who actually know how to use political leverage say that we should force every member of the House to cast a vote for or against universal health care in the midst of a pandemic that has killed more than 300,000 people, has caused more than 55 million to file for unemployment, has caused more than 12 million to lose their private health insurance, and caused an additional 8 million people to slip into poverty at a time when already 78% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. If House Democrats were smart and wanted to get reelected so they could hold on to their House majority after the 2022 midterms, they only need to look at the results of the last election to see how congressional candidates that supported Medicare for All did. Newsflash, they all won their elections. Several moderate Democrats who ran against Medicare for All are unable to say the same. In her article for Current Affairs, Brianna Joy Gray explained that elected progressives like Ocasio-Cortez, who've been reluctant to embrace the campaign to force the vote on Medicare for All in the House, have instead chosen to focus on what they believe to be more realistic achievements for the moment we currently find ourselves in. Rather than force a vote on Medicare for All, elected progressives have seemed to favor using leverage to push for things that can happen and change lives. For instance, Ocasio-Cortez has used examples such as leveraging a $15 an hour minimum wage and, quote, elevating longtime progressive champions to important positions in Democratic leadership, end quote. But independent journalist Aaron Matei recently explained that, quote, Biden already supports a $15 an hour minimum wage. It won't take progressive leadership to hold him or Pelosi to something Biden already supports. It's the Senate that will decide it. In addition, there's no evidence to suggest that losing a vote on Medicare for All would take away the ability of progressives to push for other popular policies as well as Medicare for All. On top of that, prioritizing elevating progressives to leadership positions within the Democratic Party by refusing to actively fight the party establishment to force them to provide adequate assistance to the public is exactly the kind of politics as usual that allowed Pelosi to advocate for single-payer health care 30 years ago and now stand in the way of bringing the policy to the House floor today as Speaker of the House, more than 3 decades later. By the time progressives reach these positions of power, it's likely they'll be just as bogged down by politics as usual as Pelosi currently is. Other critics of the Force the Vote campaign, such as Ryan Grimm of The Intercept, have stated that the argument that forcing a vote on Medicare for All would force politicians to go on the record either supporting or opposing a policy that's supported by 90% of Democratic voters and more than 70% of the public, along with more than 50% of Republicans, is meaningless because, quote, we already know who supports Medicare for All, and I can promise you it would get zero press coverage because the press doesn't cover bills that can't pass both chambers, end quote. Fortunately, Brianna Joy Gray uses a few examples from recent history to explain why Grimm is incorrect here. For example, just a few weeks ago, the House passed a bill to decriminalize marijuana that was certain not to be brought up for a vote in the Senate, and the press covered it widely as a historic event. In addition, the House recently passed a bill to increase stimulus checks to $2,000, but the Republican-controlled Senate has indicated that it won't bring the bill up for a vote. Regardless, the press has still spent a lot of time covering this bill. These examples prove that media attention can be attracted to an issue by forcing bold progressive policies to the floor for a vote in a Democratic-controlled House, and then forcing a Republican Senate to take the blame for not advancing the bill to the White House. Grimm is also incorrect in stating that the co-sponsor list for Medicare for All allows the public to see who's for and against it, because several co-sponsors of the bill have since distanced themselves from supporting it. For example, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker co-sponsored the bill for Medicare for All in the Senate, but during their presidential campaigns, they reversed their positions on the bill. Other critics of the Force the Vote campaign, such as David Sirota of the Daily Poster, have stated that only demanding a floor vote on Medicare for All is too little to ask for in these unprecedented times. Sirota isn't wrong, but those who've organized the Force the Vote campaign have explained that, quote, agitating a floor vote also doesn't foreclose making other demands at the same time, end quote. In her article, Gray explains that the argument is both and, not either or. This means that the arguments made by those on the left in favor of more technocratic, long-term solutions aren't completely wrong, but on their own, they're nowhere near adequate when it comes to getting the public assistance they desperately need right now. In order to ignite the public support that can force the bipartisan ruling class to act in the interests of the people, Democrats have to embrace bold, progressive solutions, such as force the vote. According to Gray, a floor vote on Medicare for All could capitalize on the public's overwhelming approval for Medicare for All and expose the chasm between the policies Democratic voters want and the positions their elected representatives are willing to take. It's difficult to imagine a better historical context for this fight. As of right now, Representative Ocasio-Cortez and every other progressive that's supporting Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House without using their leverage to force her to bring progressive policy to the floor for a vote is only enabling the establishment to deny the American public health care in the midst of a pandemic and economic crisis that's killed more than 300,000 people, thrown more than 55 million out of work, and caused more than 14 million to lose their private health insurance at a time when nearly 90 million Americans were already uninsured or underinsured and struggling with massive amounts of medical debt. Progressives talk about healthcare being a human right, but they continue to refuse to use their leverage to force an actual vote on it. They'll say that challenging party leadership by using their leverage to force a vote on Medicare for All is too risky because it could cost progressives committee assignments or cause Pelosi to lose the speakership to a Republican. But they never mentioned that all Nancy Pelosi would have to do to get reelected as Speaker of the House is bring legislation that's supported by nearly 90% of Democratic voters and more than 70% of the public to the House floor for a vote. If Nancy Pelosi refuses to bring Medicare for All to the floor for a vote and she ends up getting replaced by a Republican, that's her fault. And it would be because she prioritized her corporate donors that don't support Medicare for All over her constituents that do. According to Gray, quote, forcing a vote on Medicare for All would pressure House Democrats to either support the bill or defend their no votes as single payers' popularity spikes, end quote. Politicians enjoy being off the record. It allows them to claim that they support a policy whenever it's politically convenient for them, while simultaneously refusing to use their power to make that policy a reality whenever they have the chance. As long as a politician can stay off the record, the public can simply believe whatever they say that they support to be true. This is one of the reasons why centrist Democrats who talk about healthcare being a human right don't want Medicare for All to come to the floor for a vote. If they're on the record voting against Medicare for All, then they can't continue to pretend to support the policy by saying that healthcare is a human right, and they'll be subject to a primary challenge from the left. While if they vote in support of Medicare for All, then they're going to see a good portion of their fundraising from corporate donors vanish. According to Jimmy Dore, now is the time for progressives to exercise their power, play hardball, and use their power for the benefit of their constituents. If Medicare for All loses, then we know who's on our side and who is not. Then we can put a marker down. If enough progressives refuse to support Pelosi unless she promises to bring Medicare for All to the floor for a vote in the House, they can force a vote on universal health care in the middle of the worst public health crisis in American history, while the policy is most popular. During the last election cycle, every House Democrat running that supported Medicare for All won their elections, while numerous Democrats that ran against it lost. If Democrats were smart and wanted to get reelected to hold on to their majority in the House during a Biden administration, they should look at how Democrats that didn't support Medicare for All did last election and act accordingly. You can find out more about the Force the Vote campaign on their website. Force the Vote is holding a town hall event tomorrow night with the help from the Movement for a People's Party. The town hall will begin at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Participants of the event will include Jimmy Dore of The Jimmy Dore Show, independent journalist and former press secretary for the 2020 Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, Brianna Joy Gray. Philosopher and political activist Cornel West. Chargers running back and member of the advisory council for the People's Party, Justin Jackson. Co-host of Rising on the Hill TV, Crystal Ball. Host of Secular Talk and co-founder of Justice Democrats, Kyle Kalinske. And founding member of the People's Party, Nick Brana. The 15 elected progressives previously mentioned have all been invited to this town hall event. In a message to these elected progressives, the campaign to force the vote has said, tens of millions of Americans are struggling without health care in the middle of a pandemic, and we have a fleeting opportunity to bring Medicare for All to the floor of the House for a vote. Medicare for All is overwhelmingly popular, and forcing the policy has enormous support in the progressive movement. Please join thousands of your biggest supporters to discuss. Force the vote.